If someone had told me 10 years ago, when I first moved into this duplex, that the man on the other side of the wall would become the axis on which my world turned, I would have laughed. A dry, brittle sound, the kind that only comes from a life lived in the quiet stacks of a library, surrounded by the ghosts of other people's stories instead of living one of your own. My story was simple. It was neat. It had margins and footnotes, and a very predictable ending. His name was Julian, and he was the antithesis of everything my life had become. I knew him first through sound. The heavy tread of his work boots on the shared porch. The low rumble of his truck starting before the sun had even thought about rising. The jarring, percussive sound of his hammer from his workshop in the garage, a sound that felt like a violation of the scholarly silence I cultivated. He was noise. He was motion. He was a constant, low-grade disturbance in the carefully curated tranquility of my existence. From my window, the one overlooking our sorry excuse for a share backyard, I observed him. He was a man built of broad planes and solid lines, all wide shoulders and strong back. His hands, even from a distance, looked capable, calloused, permanently stained with the honest dirt of labor. He moved with an uncomplicated confidence that I both envied and resented. He seemed to take up more space in the world than I did, to breathe more of its air. My life was contained within the four walls of my apartment and the hushed halls of the university archive, where I worked. I was a cataloger of forgotten things. My days were spent with brittle paper and fading ink, my hands gloved in white cotton to protect history from the oils of the present. I spoke more to long-dead poets through their letters than I did to the living. Solitude was not a condition. It was a craft I had perfected. Julian and I existed in a state of polite, mutual ignorance. A nod if we passed on the walkway. A tight-lipped smile if we both got the mail at the same time. We had lived separated by a single layer of plaster and wood for a decade, and I probably knew the migratory patterns of 18th century songbirds better than I knew the color of his eyes. But I felt his presence like a change in barometric pressure. It was a low hum beneath the surface of my quiet life. An awareness. Sometimes late at night, when the house settled into its bones, I would press my ear to the wall. I could hear the faint murmur of his television, the creak of his floorboards. It was a strange, disembodied intimacy, listening to the shape of his solitude, so different from my own. His was an empty space waiting to be filled. Mine was a fortress designed to keep everything out. He was, I had decided long ago, arrogant. The way he never seemed to doubt a single movement, the easy way he spoke to the delivery drivers, the casual assumption that the world would bend to the force of his will. He was everything I was not. Physical, certain, grounded in the tangible world of wood and steel. I was a creature of theory and text. My body little more than a necessary vessel for my overthinking mind. The distance between us was more than a wall. It was a chasm of temperament, of lifestyle, of purpose. He built things. I preserved them. He lived in a loud, messy present. I curated the silent past. There was no bridge between those two worlds. I was certain of it. And that certainty was a kind of comfort, another brick in the fortress I had built around my heart. A heart I suspected was made of the same brittle paper I handled every day. Then came the storm. It wasn't a surprise. The weather forecasters had been breathless about it for a week. A once-in-a-generation blizzard, they called it. A meteorological monster. I did what I always did in the face of impending chaos. I prepared. I checked my supply of candles, stocked up on tinned soup and crackers, and pulled a stack of unread historical monographs from my work bag. I would simply wait it out, an island of quiet order in a world of white fury. The storm arrived as promised, a soft whisper of flakes that quickly became a raging, horizontal torrent. The world outside my window dissolved into a churning vortex of white. The wind screamed like a banshee, rattling the old window frames, a physical assault on my carefully constructed silence. It was a force of nature, raw and untamable. It was Julian in meteorological form. The power went out on the second day. A sudden, jarring cessation of the electric hum that underscores modern life. The refrigerator fell silent. The digital clock on the stove blinked out of existence. I was plunged into a deeper quiet than even I was used to, a silence that felt heavy, weighted. I lit my candles, their small flames dancing and casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. It was almost peaceful, a temporary return to a simpler time. And then I heard the sound, a soft, insidious hiss, followed by a groan, a sound of protest from the very bones of the house. I followed it to the kitchen, my socked feet suddenly cold and wet. A pool of water was spreading from beneath the sink, dark and menacing in the candlelight. The hiss was louder here, a venomous whisper. The pipes, the ancient, temperamental plumbing of this old duplex had finally surrendered to the cold. Panic, an unfamiliar and unwelcome guest, fluttered in my chest. A frantic trap bird. This was a problem of the physical world. A problem of pressure and metal and water. A problem I had no language for. My expertise was in deciphering 17th century script, not in staunching a domestic hemorrhage. I stood there, useless, as the water crept across my linoleum floor, a rising tide of my own incompetence. There was only one thing to do, an option so repellent, so contrary to my every instinct, that it took me a full 10 minutes of watching the water spread to even consider it. I had to ask for help. I had to knock on Julian's door. Pulling on my boots and a heavy coat over my sweater felt like donning armor for a battle I was already certain to lose. The short journey across the shared porch was a brutal campaign against the wind and driving snow. It stole the breath from my lungs and stung my face with ice. By the time I reached his door, I was shaking, and not just from the cold. I knocked. The sound was swallowed by the howl of the wind. I knocked again, harder this time, my knuckles rapping against the solid wood. For a moment, there was nothing. My heart sank with a perverse sense of relief. He wasn't home. He was gone. I could return to my sinking ship and go down with it, alone, as I was meant to. Then, a heavy thud from within. The sound of a bolt being drawn. The door swung inward. And there he was. He filled the doorway, a silhouette against the warm, flickering light of his own apartment. He was bigger up close, more substantial. He wore a thick flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and dusted with dark hair. His face, illuminated by the lantern he held, was stark with shadows. In his eyes, for the first time, I saw their color. They were a deep, startling hazel, like moss and whiskey, and they were fixed on me with an expression of blunt surprise. Thou? His voice was a low rumble, deeper than I'd imagined. He said my name. He actually knew my name. I'm sorry. I stammered, the words snatched away by the wind. I'm so sorry to bother you. It's my pipes. They've burst. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, his gaze taking in my shivering frame, the panic that must have been playing on my face. The silence stretched, filled only by the screaming wind. This is it. He's going to tell me it's not his problem. He's going to close the door. Instead, he stepped back. Come in, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a command. A simple, two-word solution to a problem I'd seen as insurmountable. Get in here before you freeze. I stumbled inside, out of the storm and into the startling warmth of his home. He shut the door behind me, the heavy sound of the deadbolt sliding into place, cutting off the howl of the wind. The silence that fell was absolute. It was the silence of a sanctuary. And in that silence, my heart, which had been a frantic bird against my ribs, suddenly felt like it had forgotten how to beat at all. His apartment was the negative image of mine. Where mine was filled with books and meticulously ordered clutter, his was spare, functional. A large, comfortable-looking couch faced a stone fireplace where a healthy fire crackled and spat, casting a warm, golden glow over everything. Tools lay on a workbench in the corner, not messy, but arranged with a clear sense of purpose. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something else. Something that was just him. Let me see, he said, already grabbing a heavy coat and pulling on his boots. He took the lantern from the mantelpiece without asking for my permission to enter my home. He simply assumed the role of rescuer. The thought should have bristled, but I was too cold and too grateful to care. I led him back across the porch into the disaster zone of my apartment. The water was higher now, covering half the kitchen floor. He swore under his breath, a low, soft sound. He waded in without hesitation, found a main shut-off valve under the sink with an instinct that felt like magic to me, and with a grunt of effort, wrenched it closed. The hissing died. The immediate crisis was over. He stood up, wiping his wet hands on his jeans. "It's bad," he said, his voice grim. The pipe split wide open. "Nothing to be done until this storm breaks and I can get the parts. You can't stay here. The temperature is going to drop tonight. Everything will freeze solid, including you." The words hung in the cold, damp air between us. "You can't stay here." My carefully ordered world, my fortress, had been breached and rendered uninhabitable. I had nowhere to go. The roads were impassable. The city was shut down. I am completely and utterly alone. The thought was a shard of ice in my gut. As if he heard the thought, he looked at me, his hazel eyes unreadable in the gloom. "You'll stay with me," he said. Again, not a question. A statement of fact. "Grab what you need. Clothes. Your books. Whatever." And just like that, the chasm between our worlds was bridged. Not by a polite exchange or a gradual warming, but by a catastrophic failure of plumbing and a force of nature. I was being forced into his space, into his life, by circumstances entirely beyond my control. The idea was terrifying. It was also, to a secret, shameful part of my soul, thrilling. I moved through my dark, cold apartment on autopilot, gathering a change of clothes, my toothbrush, and, out of pure instinct, the book I was currently reading. I was a refugee in my own home. Every object I touched felt alien, part of a life that had been suspended. When I returned to the kitchen, Julian was waiting, holding a box. He had already packed up the food from my refrigerator and freezer, salvaging what he could before it spoiled. He saw me looking at the box, at the quiet competence of the act. A faint flush crept up his neck. "No sense in it going to waste," he muttered, looking away from me. It was the first crack I had ever seen in his armor of certainty. The first hint of a man who was perhaps not as blunt and unthinking as I had judged him to be. We made the trip back to his side of the duplex. This time, he carried the box of my food and a stack of my books he'd insisted on grabbing. I followed in his wake, a displaced person seeking asylum. He locked the door behind us again, and the sound echoed with a strange finality. My old life was on the other side of that wall, frozen and broken. A new one was beginning here, in the firelight, with a man I barely knew. A man I had spent years watching from a distance, weaving into a narrative of my own making. Now, the real man was here, and I had no idea who he was. "You can take the couch," he said, gesturing with his head. "It's comfortable enough." He disappeared into his own kitchen, and I heard the clatter of pots and pans. I stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, my small bag of belongings feeling pathetic in my hands. The room was dominated by his presence, even when he wasn't in it. His coat was slung over a chair. A single coffee mug sat by the sink. It was a space that was unequivocally his. I was an intruder, an anomaly. He returned with 2 steaming mugs. He handed one to me. It was hot, sweet tea. The warmth seeped into my frozen fingers, a small, profound comfort. "Thanks," I managed to say. My voice sounded thin. He just grunted in response, settling into the large armchair by the fire, leaving the entire couch for me. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the relentless howl of the wind outside. It should have been awkward, a tense standoff between 2 strangers. But it wasn't. The shared crisis, the warmth of the fire, it created a strange kind of truce. The silence felt companionable. I watched him over the rim of my mug. The firelight carved his face into sharp angles and soft shadows. It caught the flicker of gold in his eyes and highlighted the lines of exhaustion around them. He looked older than I'd thought, more weary. The arrogant confidence I had perceived from a distance was replaced by a quiet, grounded solidity. He wasn't posturing. He just was. I noticed things I never could have from my window. A faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow. The way his thumb absently traced the rim of his mug. The slight chip on his front tooth, visible only when his lips parted. These were the small, intimate details of a person, the footnotes to the main text. And I found myself wanting to read them all. He caught me staring. I looked away quickly, my face burning, and took a nervous sip of my tea. My heart did that stupid, fluttering thing again. "You're quiet," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. "I work in an archive," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. Quiet is the language I'm most fluent in. A small smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines. "I guess I'm the opposite. My work is all noise. Saws, hammers, drills. Can't hear yourself think most days. I hear it sometimes," I admitted, then immediately wished I hadn't. It sounded like a confession, or a complaint. He looked at me, his expression curious. "Does it bother you?" "No," I said, perhaps too quickly. "It's just a reminder that the world is still being built." He seemed to consider that for a moment, his gaze distant. "We're just taken apart and put back together," he said, his voice softer now. "Most of my work is repairs. Fixing what's broken." The words hung in the air, laden with unspoken meaning. Fixing what's broken. Like my pipes. Like my life, suddenly upended. He was a man who fixed things. I was a man who preserved things in their state of decay. The evening wore on. He made us dinner from my salvaged food and his own supplies, moving around his kitchen with an easy, unhurried grace. It was a simple meal of pasta and sauce, but it felt like the most significant one I had ever eaten. We ate sitting on the floor by the fire, the plates balanced on our knees. The rigid formality of my life had been stripped away. There were no tables, no place settings, just two people sharing a meal against the backdrop of a raging storm. He started talking. Not about anything important, really. He told me about the house he was currently renovating across town, the unforeseen problems with its foundation. He spoke of wood grains and support beams with a passion I usually reserve for historical documents. I listened, fascinated, not just by the content, but by the simple act of him sharing it with me. He was opening a small door into his world, and I was peering inside, mesmerized. I, in turn, found myself talking about my own work. I told him about the collection of a 19th century botanist I was currently cataloging, the delicate pressed flowers and the spidery script detailing their discovery. I expected him to be bored, to tune me out, but he listened intently, asking questions, his hazel eyes fixed on my face. He made me feel, for the first time in a very long time, interesting. Later, as the fire burned down to glowing embers, a comfortable quiet settled over us again. He stood up and disappeared into a back room, returning with a thick pile of blankets and a pillow. "Here," he said, dropping them on the couch. "It's not a proper bed, but it's warm." "Thank you, Julian," I said, and the name felt strange and significant on my tongue. "For everything." He just nodded, his back to me as he banked the fire for the night. "Get some sleep, Leo." I lay down on the couch, pulling the heavy blankets over me. They smelled like him. That scent of wood smoke and clean laundry and something uniquely masculine. It was an impossibly intimate thing, to be wrapped in the scent of a man I barely knew. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of his breathing from the other room. The wall between us was gone, and I felt exposed, vulnerable, and strangely, inexplicably safe. The next morning, the world was silent. The wind had died, leaving behind a landscape buried in a thick, pristine blanket of snow. The light that filtered through the windows was blue and soft. The power was still out. I found Julian in the kitchen, coaxing a flame to life on a small camping stove. He was already dressed, his hair damp, as if he'd washed it with cold water. He looked solid and capable, a pillar of calm in the strange, muffled world the snow had created. "Coffee?" he asked without turning around. "Please." We drank our coffee standing by the window, looking out at the transformed world. The snow was piled in enormous drifts, burying cars and fences, smoothing all the hard edges of the world into soft, white curves. It was beautiful and daunting. "We're not going anywhere for a while," he said, stating the obvious. The thought of being trapped here, with him, sent a fresh wave of anxiety and something else, something warm and hopeful, through me. Another day, maybe two, an extension of this strange, temporary life we had fallen into. We spent the day in a quiet domestic rhythm that felt both alien and deeply natural. He showed me how to split kindling for the fire, his large hands patiently guiding mine on the handle of the small axe. His fingers brushed against mine, a brief, electric contact that sent a jolt straight through my system. I snatched my hand back as if burned. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't comment. But the memory of that touch stayed with me, a phantom heat on my skin. My stomach was a hive of bees. My mind, a frantic librarian trying to catalog a million new sensations at once. The way his hair curls at the nape of his neck. The sound of his low laugh when I almost drop a log on my foot. The concentration in his eyes as he studies a problem. These were new data points, observations that completely contradicted my decade-long thesis on the man named Julian. He wasn't arrogant. He was competent. He wasn't loud. He was expressive. He wasn't a threat to my quiet world. He was something else entirely. Something I couldn't yet name. That afternoon, the dynamic between us shifted. He was trying to fix a broken shutter outside the window, working on a small ladder propped against the house. I watched from inside, a cup of tea warming my hands. He was reaching, stretching, and suddenly his foot slipped on an icy rung. He fell. It wasn't a long drop, maybe only a few feet into a deep snowdrift, but he landed awkwardly with a sharp, bitten-off cry of pain. I was out the door in a second, not even stopping to put on my coat. I scrambled through the deep snow to his side. He was sitting up, his face pale and tight, cradling his left wrist. "Are you okay?" The words were breathless with panic. "I'm fine," he gritted out, but a wave of pain washed over his face, belying the words. "Just my wrist. I think I sprained it." Suddenly, our roles were reversed. He, the capable rescuer, was hurt, and I, the helpless academic, was the only one there to help. The playing field had been leveled by a patch of ice and gravity. "Let me see," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. I knelt in the snow beside him, gently taking his arm. He flinched but let me. His wrist was already starting to swell. It was a problem I actually knew how to solve, thanks to a mandatory first aid course the university had made all staff take years ago. I helped him inside, my arm around his broad back, supporting his weight. He was leaning on me. The thought was staggering. Julian was leaning on me. He felt so solid, so warm, even through his thick coat. I settled him into the armchair by the fire and went to work. I found a bag of frozen peas in the freezer for the swelling and some painkillers in his bathroom cabinet. I wrapped his wrist carefully with an elastic bandage I found in the same first aid kit. My fingers moved with a precision and confidence that surprised me. I was in my element, a problem that required careful, methodical attention. As I worked, my head was bent close to his. I could smell the cold, fresh scent of the snow in his hair. I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He was utterly still, watching my hands as they moved over his skin. When I was done, I looked up and met his eyes. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. It was vulnerable and soft and filled with a kind of wonder. "You're good at that," he said, his voice quiet. "Required training." I deflected, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. They worry about librarians getting paper cuts and falling off step stools. He didn't smile. He just kept looking at me. "Thank you, Leo." The rest of the day, he was subdued. The small injury seemed to have taken his energy, or perhaps it was the shock. I took over the domestic duties, keeping the fire fed, making us another simple meal. He sat in the armchair, his injured wrist resting on a pillow, and watched me. I was acutely aware of his gaze on me as I moved around his space. It wasn't a critical gaze. It felt appreciative, like he was seeing me for the first time. That night, the third night of the blackout, the cold deepened. The fire was our only source of heat, and the room grew chilly away from its immediate glow. We sat on the rug before the hearth, huddled close together for warmth, a blanket shared over our shoulders. We didn't talk for a long time. The silence was different now. It was charged, filled with everything that had passed between us in the last 48 hours. The storm, the burst pipe, the fall, the shared meals, the accidental touches. It was a silence that felt more intimate than any conversation. His shoulder was pressed against mine. I could feel the solid muscle and bone of him through our layers of clothing. I focused on breathing, in and out. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. This is insane. He's your neighbor. He's just being kind. I've lived here for 10 years, he said suddenly, his voice a low murmur that seemed to vibrate right through me. And I feel like I'm meeting you for the first time. I swallowed hard. I know the feeling. He turned his head to look at me. In the flickering firelight, his eyes were dark pools of sincerity. I always thought, I don't know, I thought you didn't like me. That you thought I was just some dumb, loud lout making a racket next door. The confession was so honest, so vulnerable, it stole the air from my lungs. It was a mirror of my own secret judgments, my own unfair assumptions. I thought you were arrogant, I admitted, the words tasting like ash. I thought you were too much for a world that was trying to keep small and quiet. And now, he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Now I think my entire world has been small and quiet for no reason at all. Now I think I've been living in black and white, and you just walked in carrying every color I never knew existed. Now, I said, my voice shaking slightly, I think I was a fool. He shifted, turning his body more fully toward me. The blanket slipped from his shoulder. He didn't seem to notice the cold. His gaze was intense, searching. Leo, he began, then stopped. He licked his lips, a small, nervous gesture that seemed so out of character. I've watched you. Through the window. In your garden. The way you read on your porch. I always wanted to say something, but I never knew what. You always seemed so complete. Like you didn't need anyone. My carefully constructed fortress crumbled into dust. The solitude I had cultivated as a sign of strength, he had interpreted as a wall of rejection. We had been two lonely men on opposite sides of a wall, both too afraid to knock. I'm not, I breathed. I'm not complete. The space between us became charged, electric. The air grew thick. He lifted his good hand, his right hand, and slowly, hesitantly, he cupped my jaw. His thumb stroked my cheek, the callous skin a rough, wonderful abrasion against mine. It was the most deliberate, most terrifying, most exquisite touch I had ever known. My eyes fluttered shut. This is happening. This is actually happening. He leaned in, and I met him halfway. His lips were soft, hesitant at first. A question, a shy exploration in the dark. It wasn't a kiss of passion, not yet. It was a kiss of profound, staggering relief. It was the sound of two quiet worlds colliding, of a decade of unspoken things finally finding a language. I opened my mouth to him, a surrender, an invitation. He deepened the kiss, his arm sliding around my back, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us at all. We were just two men, huddled by a fire, while the world outside was frozen and still. And in that moment, I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. It was a thaw deep inside me, in a place that had been frozen for a very, very long time. The next morning, I woke up on the couch, tangled in blankets. For a disoriented moment, I didn't know where I was. It all came rushing back. The fire, the confession, the kiss. A slow, spreading warmth filled my chest. A feeling so unfamiliar was almost alarming. Hope. I sat up. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. A strange, yellow light was filtering through the windows. And I could hear it. A low, familiar hum. The refrigerator. The power was back on. The thought sent a jolt of pure, undiluted panic through me. The storm was over. The crisis had passed. The magical, suspended reality we had been living in for 3 days was gone, replaced by the harsh, electric glare of the real world. Julian was not in the armchair. He wasn't in the kitchen. I stood up, my legs unsteady. His bedroom door was closed. I listened, but heard nothing. I felt a sudden, desperate need to see him, to confirm that last night was real, that it wasn't just some fever dream born of cold and proximity. As I stood there, hesitating, his bedroom door opened. He emerged, fully dressed in his work clothes. His hair was combed. He didn't look at me. He moved with a brisk, businesslike efficiency that felt like a slap in the face. "Power's back," he said, his voice flat, neutral. He went to the kitchen and started making coffee with his electric coffee maker, the machine's gurgle sounding unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "Road should be plowed by noon." I can get the parts one need to fix your pipe, then. There was no mention of last night. No Ismite. No soft look in his eyes. It was as if a switch had been flipped. The vulnerable, open man from the fireside was gone, replaced by the capable, distant contractor. My heart, which had felt so warm and full moments before, began to shrink to ice over. A cold dread seeped into my veins. It was a mistake, a trick of the light, a moment of weakness brought on by the storm. He regrets it. Julian, I said, my voice small. He turned, finally looking at me, but his eyes were guarded, his expression unreadable. The warmth was gone. Yeah, about last night. I trailed off, not knowing how to finish. Pleading? Questioning? He looked away, busying himself with the coffee mugs. We were cold. It was a weird couple of days. He said it so casually, as if dismissing a minor weather event. He was invalidating it, erasing it, and with each word, he was rebuilding the wall between us, brick by painful brick. He grabbed his keys from the hook by the door. I'm going to go see if I can dig my truck out, he said, still not looking at me. I'll be back later. And then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone in his apartment, which suddenly felt cold again, despite the power being on. The scent of him was still in the blankets, the indentation of his body still in the armchair. The ghost of our intimacy mocked me from every corner of the room. I sank onto the couch, my body trembling. A wave of shame so profound it made me nauseous washed over me. I had misread everything. I had taken a moment of shared human comfort and twisted it into something more, something he clearly never intended. I was a fool, an old, lonely fool who had projected his pathetic fantasies onto the first person to show him a sliver of kindness. The silence of the apartment was no longer companionable. It was accusatory. It hummed with the frequency of my own humiliation. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't bear to be in his space, surrounded by the evidence of my own idiocy. I gathered my few things, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip my bag. I folded the blankets he had given me, placing them neatly on the couch, a pathetic attempt to erase my presence, to undo the last 3 days. Then, I let myself out of his apartment and walked back into my own. The cold hit me immediately. The air was frigid, and the puddle on the kitchen floor had frozen into a sheet of slick, ugly ice. My home was broken, cold, and uninhabitable, a perfect metaphor for my heart. I spent the next few hours in a haze of self-recrimination. I sat on my bed, wrapped in my coat, and stared at the wall that separated my world from his. The wall that was back in place, thicker and more impenetrable than ever before. Every creak of the house, every distant sound from outside, made me jump. I was waiting for him to come back, dreading it, longing for it. The hours crawled by. 1, 3, 5. The sun was beginning to set, painting the snow outside in shades of orange and purple. There was no sound from his apartment, no rumble of his truck returning. He was gone. He had fixed the immediate problem, me, by giving me shelter, and now he was just gone. Maybe he wouldn't come back at all. Maybe he'd just leave me here in my frozen apartment to deal with the mess I had created in every sense of the word. The solitude I had once cherished now felt like a punishment. It was no longer a peaceful fortress. It was a desolate prison. The silence wasn't restful. It was empty. It was an absence, a Julian-shaped void that ached with a physical intensity. I had tasted connection, real human connection, for the first time in years, and now the memory of it was a torment. Darkness fell. I didn't bother with the lights. I just sat there in the cold and the dark, a fitting penance for my foolishness. I had survived the storm. I wasn't sure I would survive the thaw. Then I heard it. The crunch of tires on snow. Headlights swept across my window, momentarily illuminating the room before vanishing. A truck door slammed shut. Footsteps on the porch. Heavy, familiar footsteps. My heart leaped into my throat. He's back. The footsteps went to his door. I heard the jingle of his keys, the sound of his door opening and closing. And then silence. A deep, profound silence from the other side of the wall. He was home. He was 10 feet away, and he might as well have been on the moon. I waited. For what? I didn't know. A knock? A call? Anything. Nothing came. The silence stretched, pulling taut, becoming a physical weight that pressed down on my chest. Of course. Why would he knock? I was back in my space, he was in his. The transaction was complete. The emergency was over. We were back to being neighbors. Strangers. A terrible, bitter resolve began to form in my chest. Fine. If that's how he wanted it, fine. I wouldn't be the pathetic, needy one. I would be the quiet archivist again. I would retreat back into my books, into my silence. I would rebuild my fortress, stronger this time. I would forget the feel of his hand on my face, the taste of his lips, the warmth of his presence beside me in the dark. I would catalog the memory and file it away in a dusty, forgotten corner of my mind. Fueled by this new, brittle anger, I stood up. I went to the kitchen and began to tackle the mess. I found a bucket and started chipping away at the ice, my movements jerky and violent. I would fix my own damn house. I would fix my own damn life. I didn't need a rescuer. I didn't need him. It was a lie, and I knew it. But it was the only armor I had left. I was on my hands and knees, sopping up icy water with a towel, when I heard the knock on my door. My own door. Not a loud, confident rap, but a soft, hesitant tapping. I froze. My entire body went rigid. It had to be him. No one else would be out in this. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Maybe if I stayed silent, he would go away. Maybe it was better if he went away. The knock came again, a little louder this time. Now, his voice, muffled through the wood, but unmistakably his. It was quiet, uncertain. It broke through my anger, my pride, all of it. With a sigh that felt like a surrender, I got to my feet, my knees aching from the cold floor. I walked to the door and opened it. He was standing there under the cold, bare bulb of the porch light. He wasn't wearing a coat. He looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his shoulders were slumped. He was holding a small, shiny object in his hand. We just stood there for a moment, looking at each other. The easy intimacy of the firelight was gone, replaced by a chasm of awkward, painful silence. You left, he said finally. His voice was rough. The power was on. I replied, my own voice sounding hollow. The emergency was over. That's not what I meant. He took a step closer, his eyes pleading. For the first time, I saw not confidence, not arrogance, but a deep, profound fear in his gaze. It was the same fear I had been feeling all day. Leo, I'm sorry. The simple words undid me. Why did you just leave? This morning? Why did you act like nothing happened? He ran his good hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. Because I'm an idiot, he said, his voice cracking. Because I panicked. I woke up this morning, and the power was on, and the world was back to normal, and I looked at you sleeping on my couch, and it felt too real. Too good. I don't know how to do this, Leo. I don't know how to handle that. He gestured vaguely between us. Feeling things. I'm good with wood and pipes and engines. Things that have rules. This is new territory, and it scared the hell out of me. His confession was a mirror of my own anxieties. The fear of it being too good to be true. The terror of stepping off the map of a carefully controlled life into the unknown. He wasn't rejecting me. He was just as scared as I was. I thought I'd imagined it. I whispered. I thought I had forced it. That you regretted it, regret it. He let out a short, harsh laugh. God, no. It's the only thing that's felt real to me in years. That's what was so terrifying. He looked down at his feet, then back up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I went out to get the parts to fix your pipe, and all I could think about was you. About how empty my place felt the second you walked out of it. I've been sitting in my truck for the last hour, trying to get up the nerve to come over here, the strong, silent man. The man who could fix anything. He had been sitting in his truck, paralyzed by the same fear that had been crushing me all day. We were both just as broken, just as in need of repair. He held out his hand. In his palm was a single, newly cut key. It gleamed under the porch light. I made a copy, he stammered, a dark blush creeping up his neck. My key. I thought maybe you could keep it. For emergencies. Or, for whenever. His eyes met mine, filled with a desperate, hopeful question. Or maybe for always a symbolic gesture. A tangible act of commitment. He wasn't just offering me a key to his apartment. He was offering me a key to his life, to that new, terrifying, wonderful territory he was so afraid of. He was asking me to explore it with him. Tears I hadn't realized I was holding back began to stream down my face. I reached out and took the key from his palm. It was cold from the night air, but it felt like the warmest thing I had ever held. My fingers closed around it, the metal biting into my skin. "Okay," I whispered. It was all I could manage to say. "Okay," he asked, his voice thick with relief. "Okay," I said again, a little stronger this time. I stepped forward, closing the remaining distance between us, and wrapped my arms around his neck. I buried my face in his shoulder, inhaling the familiar scent of him. He let out a shuddering breath, and his arms came around me, holding me tightly, his good hand tangled in my hair. "Your house is still broken," he murmured into my ear. "I know," I said, my voice muffled by his shirt. "Stay with me," he said. It wasn't a command this time. It was a plea. "Stay with me until it's fixed. Stay with me after—" I pulled back just enough to look at him. His face was so close to mine, his hazel eyes searching my own. The fear was gone, replaced by a look of such raw, open affection that it made my heart ache. "Yes," I said, and I kissed him, right there on the freezing porch under the bare, unflattering light bulb. It wasn't a hesitant, questioning kiss like the first one. It was a kiss of certainty, a promise, a beginning. The next morning, I woke up not on his couch, but in his bed. The sun was streaming through the window, bright and clear. He was still asleep, his arm thrown over my waist, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm against my back. I lay there for a long time, not moving, just savoring the simple, profound fact of his presence. There was no anxiety, no fear, just a deep, quiet sense of rightness. We fixed my apartment together over the next week. He showed me how to cut and solder a new copper pipe, his hands guiding mine, his body pressed against my back. I patched the drywall, my movements slow and careful. We worked in a comfortable silence, punctuated by easy conversation and shared smiles. We were rebuilding my home, but it felt like we were building a new one, together, one that spanned both sides of the wall. Life settled into a new routine, a new normal. My mornings no longer started with scholarly silence, but with the scent of coffee and the sound of his movements in the kitchen. I would find him at my kitchen table, reading one of my books, a look of intense concentration on his face. He would leave for work with a kiss that tasted of coffee and promises. My evenings were no longer spent alone. We cooked dinner together. We sat by the fire, not talking, just being. Sometimes he would read over my shoulder, asking questions about the archaic texts I was translating. And sometimes I would just watch him, watch the play of firelight on his face, and feel a sense of peace so deep it felt like it had settled into my very bones. My world was no longer small and quiet. It was filled with the sound of his laughter, the warmth of his touch, the solid, grounding presence of him. He hadn't destroyed my quiet world. He had just opened the door and let the rest of life in. He was the plot twist I never saw coming, the disruption that had led not to chaos, but to a better, truer version of myself. One night, months later, we were lying in bed, the quiet of the house wrapped around us like a blanket. He was tracing patterns on my back with his finger, a habit of his I had come to adore. "It's funny," I said into the darkness. "For 10 years, you were just the noise on the other side of the wall." He was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned in and kissed my shoulder. "And you," he whispered, his voice warm against my skin, "were the silence," and I realized that's what we were. The noise and the silence. Two halves of a whole, who had spent a decade living apart, separated by a thin layer of plaster, waiting for a storm strong enough to finally break down the wall.